Are you still with that agent?
Oh, yes, I'm one of those rare people who's been with the same agent from the very beginning. Meredith Bernstein is her name, and I didn't know when Meredith and I started out that she was just starting out as an independent agent. And now I realize that was probably a stroke of luck. But because she was just starting out, I was more important to her than a big agent would have been. And so we kind of grew up in the business together, and we've been together. I've had some long associations in publishing. I had an editor who's not at Pocket Books any longer. She's at Ballantine, Linda Marrow, who has been with me just for years and years, and those sorts of relationships are so rare in publishing anymore.
They really are.
That I value them a great deal.
And in fact, it's interesting that Pocket was willing to switch series with you and move into the Marie Lightfoot, because so often to do that, you really have to start with someone else.
I think that they were not only willing, they were eager for me to do it, because the way publishing is these days, even if you have a successful series, and I think by almost anybody's standards the Jenny Kane series was successful, but it was not a best-selling series in terms of PW, Publishers Weekly, or New York Times, or USA Today.
You mean it didn't produce those huge numbers?
Didn't produce the huge numbers. And so in today's marketing world, it doesn't appear to be enough to have a series that always earns back the money that your advance. You have to keep making bigger and bigger leaps, for good or for ill. And that series had not made that leap. So even though it had been a profitable series, it wasn't enough. And
well,
it's not as if my publisher said you have to do something else, but when I said I'd like to, their eyes lit up, and and it was real clear that they were glad for me to try something else that might give me my career a little boost.
Yeah, but it wasn't just that. I know you and I had a discussion when you came to sign The Whole Truth that the Jenny Kane series for you was pretty much wound down. In fact, didn't you say that the last 3 books you realized that you were writing more about Jenny's personal life than you were actually writing crime stories?
Absolutely. I felt that there had been a dramatic arc to the series having to do with her life as much as anything, and it had come to a natural pause, if not end. Now lately, I've been on a book tour, and I've had the pleasure of having a lot of people tell me they miss Jenny, and I hadn't been around for a while, so that's really so nice to hear. And it's taken me by surprise a little bit. Maybe it shouldn't, but it has taken me by surprise. And it's not that it's made me want to go home and write a Jenny. I'm not ready to do that, but something's tickling the back of my mind, and I'm thinking maybe in the years to come there might be 1 or 2 more Jenny Kanes, but only if I really have stories I really want to tell.
Right, you don't want to just chronicle more episodes in her life.
Right.
I think, you're so wise to see that, because it is easy to take a series probably past its natural ending point because it's marketable and because, it's kind of like soup cans or whatever it is. Everybody knows the label. And really, to make them work, I think when you get to that stage, you have to do a lot of, I don't want to say bizarre, but you really have to push things out of shape. You have to kill off people close to them, or you have to wrench their life with some perfectly ghastly incident.
It gets harder and harder to have true suspense of any sort.
Right.
And that's why their lives start taking over rather than the mysteries, I think. As you know, the Jenny Kane series was set in what started out as a very small town in New England, Port Frederick. It kind of got bigger as the series went on. It had urban redevelopment and everything. And there's, after a while, I felt as if I had killed off everybody in Port Frederick, and the town needs to repopulate a bit before we can kill anybody else off there. But it just, it begins to feel a little ridiculous to be killing people right and left in the same town. And when you have a series that people relate to almost as if they're dealing with real people they're fond of and they want to follow their lives, then a certain reality has to be maintained, I think. And when, as the writer, you start feeling that this doesn't feel real, then that may be the time to give it a rest for a while.
Well, you'd also, I think, pushed and pulled her personal life around.
Oh, yes.
As well as the other characters.
That's
and there
right.
wasn't a lot more that you could credibly alter in her family situation without, taking it. I mean, I really do, fond of as I am of her books, I think that Marcia Muller's last 2 or 3 Sharon McCones, have really pushed the family envelope past what seems logical.
It gets very difficult, and as you know, in the Jenny series, about the only thing left was whether or not Jenny and Jeff were going to have children. And so, enough already. Let them make that decision for themselves, and maybe they'll let me in on the secret someday.
Well, while you were cycling down with Jenny, I thought a very interesting project came your way. I brought my copy, in fact, of the 27-ingredient chili con carne murder with me. But talk to us a little bit about what it is to be approached by a literary estate and how all that worked.
That was really an interesting little segment of my life. I had, when I was first published, read a book called The Cooking School Murders by a writer by the name of Virginia Rich. She was the mother of the culinary mystery. And I really liked the story, and I thought I saw a similarity of writing style. And beyond that, I also saw that she was married to a cattle rancher, and at the time so was I. So I thought, surely there can't be more than two of us mystery writing women married to cattle ranchers. So I wrote her the only fan letter I'd ever written. And we began, launched a tiny little correspondence. And shortly after that, she died. But in that little bitty correspondence, I was already very fond of her. And she had mentioned that she was working on the fourth book in a series called The 27-Ingredient Chili Con Carne Murders. When she died, I felt, oh, you know how we're always so ticked off at our favorite authors when they die, how dare they? But I had to accept the fact that there were going to be no more Eugenia Potter mysteries. Well, lo and behold, there were more, and I wrote them later down the line. Several years later, her husband, Ray Rich, who was at their ranch south of Tucson, and was going through boxes of things and came across plans for a future book. And he went to her editor in New York at Delacorte and said, could we continue the series with another writer? That editor, who admits she knew very little about mysteries except for Mrs. Rich's books, went to Doubleday Bookstore in New York and started pulling mysteries off the shelves, came to one of mine, and thought she saw a similarity of writing style. Really, it's kind of amazing. Found my agent, who called me one day out of the blue and said, how would you feel about finishing a book called The 27-Ingredient Chili Con Carne Murders? And I just thought, this is something I have to do. Fate has brought this to my doorstep. So I have done 3 of those. I won't be doing any more. Now, that doesn't mean that some other writer might not take over it, but I won't be doing any more of them.
And you went on to write, what were the next 2?
The Blue Corn Murders, which is set in the Cortez area of Colorado. And the most recent one was the Secret Ingredient Murders, which actually I co-wrote. I've never done this with a novel before, but I wanted to do it as an experiment and for some other reasons too. But I co-wrote it with a writer friend of mine by the name of Sally Goldenbaum. Sally also lives in the Kansas City area where I do, and Sally had written about 24 romances and had stopped writing sometime before. And I knew she could write novels. I knew she was a fine writer. She loved the series. She's a wonderful cook. Sally had all these ingredients, plus she was one of my best friends. And I thought, well, I wonder what it would be like to write this with Sally. So I invited her to join me. I thought, my gosh, I'm already writing with a ghost. Why not write with a real living person? And also I think that I had just finished writing the first Marie Lightfoot, and there's such a difference between the Marie Lightfoot series and the Eugenia Potter series that it seemed almost insurmountable to me to switch just like that to Mrs. Rich's books without somebody to work with, and so I worked with Sally on that book.
How did you do it?
She loved to write first drafts for that book, and I wanted to do rewriting. So we would get together and we would brainstorm about plot, and then she would work on first draft, and then she'd send it to me, and then I wanted the whole book to go through my fingers because it has my name on it, and so the whole thing then would go through my fingers. But she thought of all the recipes and tested them on her husband and me.
I was going to ask you about that, because implicit in that whole series of Rich books, which now numbers 6, 3 from her and 3 from you, there are recipes.
Yeah.
And she obviously did her own for the
Yes.
first 3. And I know that when you came here to visit us, when you published the first one, the 27-Ingredient Chili Con Carne Murders, the recipe was part of the book, and we had someone cook it. And it was part of the program that we all had a chili dinner. And I wondered, I think I asked you then if you had, if you test drove all those
Absolutely.
yourself.
Oh yeah, I have tested and eaten all of the recipes in the books that I have done. The first recipes in the first book were all her recipes, and I think they're wonderful. The recipes in the second book were recipes I either thought up, I actually invented a couple of recipes, or I adapted from friends' recipes or recipes I found elsewhere. I think that they are not as good as the recipes that Mrs. Rich thought up and the recipes that Sally thought up. Those 2 women are real cooks. I'm a pretend cook. I'll tell you what I can cook. I have my only child who was born on, I can do macaroni and cheese, Kraft macaroni and cheese and things like that. I'm a little better than that. But I'm no cook, and that's one of the reasons I don't want to continue the series.